Donald Trump met with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg this week, lauding increases in payments by member states, but also calling for greater increases in commitments, particularly by European nations.
By 2020, I think we'll have at least another $100 billion spent by the allies, the other countries, the 27 countries outside of ourselves.
Exactly 70 years ago, the North American Treaty Organization was originally started by the United States, Canada, and 10 European countries with the intent to contain the Soviet Union. It now has 29 members and an expanded mandate.
We've really increased the scope of NATO. We said, we have a new world problem that's not so new anymore, but it's called terrorism, different than when you were originally founded.
Trump has reportedly and even admittedly threatened to withdraw from the military alliance he has previously called obsolete. However, despite these threats, it's clear that the Trump administration plans to stay married to the pact, as evidenced by his meeting with Stoltenberg and comments made recently by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in a recent visit to Budapest, Hungary.
Today I spoke with the foreign minister about the urgent importance of supporting Ukraine in its quest for sovereignty and territorial integrity. We must not let Putin drive wedges between friends in NATO. Hungarians know all too well from their history that an authoritarian Russia will never be a friend to the freedom and sovereignty of smaller nations.
Matthew Ho has served in the U.S. Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and the State Department, and served in posts in Afghanistan and Iraq. He believes that Trump's tendency to assail the alliance bloc is merely a political stunt, and that NATO expansion policy won't be changing anytime soon.
I think Trump's attacks on NATO have been for his own political reasons, that he wants to show his base in the United States that he's going to stand up to the Europeans, he's going to stand up to other nations, he's going to stand up for Americans. He makes a big deal of making sure other people pay for what they need, and that the United States is not going to support them. But I think it's all show. I think in the White House, in the Oval Office, when the generals and admirals and the weapon systems CEOs are present, that President Trump's attitude is much different, and he wants to make sure the United States and NATO are as powerful as possible.
Proponents of U.S. membership in NATO continue to use the specter of an aggressive Russia as a primary reason, but critics see it as likely to provoke Russia rather than keep peace on the continent, particularly as talks continue around the admission of Georgia, a nation that borders Russia. Ho made the case recently at a discussion at the National Press Club, which was sponsored by Roots Action.
NATO is extremely dangerous as well, too, because of potential conflict with Russia. As we've expanded right up to the Russian border, as we have based our troops around the Russian border, conduct exercises, the Russians have reacted as you would expect a nation to react. And so we are on the brink of war, and this is not the way it should have been as it was promised with the end of the Cold War.
During her 29-year career in the Army and Army Reserves, Colonel Ann Wright served at the NATO Subcommand Allied Forces Central Europe and later as a diplomat in various posts around the world, but resigned from the U.S. government in protest of George W. Bush's war on Iraq. She agrees with Ho that NATO is an impediment to peace in Europe.
It's dangerous because it requires a response from the Russian government, and they then have now started the largest exercises they have had since the Cold War. So it becomes very dangerous. If one starts and the other responds in the same manner, which is normally the way it happens, then we're all in big trouble.
Martin Fleck, of Physicians for Social Responsibility, argues that the combination of the Trump administration's push to pull out of nuclear non-proliferation treaties, while NATO continues to push up against Russia's borders, is a recipe for disaster.
So if you combine the United States unilaterally withdrawing from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, then the Iran nuclear deal, which Russia was a party to, and now threatening to pull out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that combined with apparent expansion of NATO right up to Russia's borders, it seems needlessly provocative, and it seems reckless. It seems like a reckless policy in combination.
Given the dangers, Wright and other critics argue that the real driving force behind the expansion of NATO is related more to finance than security.
I think it's the military-industrial complex that needs more weapons sales. And the Russians have always been the boogeyman for the United States from the Cold War period. And even though we had 20 years of peace and tranquility with the Russians, now they're being vilified again. Not to say that it's, there are some things that they've done that I don't care for at all, but the fact that now they are the enemy, and the increase in the number of weapons that all the countries are manufacturing and selling is big business.
That may also help explain NATO's expanded mandate, with forces landing as far as the Middle East and other hotspots around the world.
NATO conducts military operations around the world now to include wars, to include mass killing and suffering in places like Libya and Afghanistan, and not doing well for the world, not where you can point and say, look, we resolved this conflict, but rather these conflicts are open-ended with the suffering continual.